Hello and welcome to the two-man power trip of wrestling. I am your host, JP John Poz. With me today, special guest. He is an author, a wrestling historian, and award-winning journalist, Mr. Steven Johnson. Steve, welcome in. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on here. I always enjoy the show.
Awesome. Thank you. So what is going on in your world? What is going on with your latest project, Jim Londos? Maybe some people might not know who he is, but arguably the Hulk Hogan of a generation.
Um, you know, I would say Hulk Hogan was the Jim Londos of his generation.
There,
Here,
there you go. Well
there,
said.
there we can do a shameless plug here for ourselves. Yeah, the book Jim Londos, The Golden Greek of Professional Wrestling, is just out within the last few days on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all the usual suspects. I worked on and off, not every day, but on and off for probably 12 or 13 years to put it together because history has really missed the boat on this guy. There's a lot of reasons for that. Probably number one is that he was involved in wrestling, which is kind of the redheaded stepchild of the sports pages.
Yep.
But during his career, especially in the period from about the mid to late 20s to the late 30s, he wasn't just the most prominent wrestler in the United States, the most prominent wrestler in the world. He was probably the most well-known and certainly the most highest paid active athlete in the world. And it's almost impossible for fans to think, as we're sitting here in 2024, that 100 years ago, somebody would still be relevant today. But it's truly an amazing story about how he got people to actually care about him and care about wrestling. And that's the one timeless thing that connects wrestling then and now. You got to get people to care about it.
Why forgotten though? Isn't it? It's so crazy because if you actually look at him and the drawing power, you would say it's like a Hogan. Like, oh, you can't mistake this guy. Look, he's drawing this, he's drawing that. Look at this house, like that. So why is Londos somehow forgotten throughout history?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. But first, getting to what you said about the drawing power, consider that he drew 90,000 to 100,000 people to an outdoor stadium in Athens in 1933. Well, that held till WrestleMania 3. Now we break records every week. It's like nothing. It's like ho-hos. You just toss them away. He had an attendance record that stood for 50 years. He had a gate record in 1934 in Chicago of nearly $100,000, stood for 17 years. So, I mean, the enduring power is just amazing. But what happened in the interim is, as he kind of faded from the scene and wrestling became a little more like pantomime, character-based, Gorgeous George type of flamboyance, it sort of fell off the sports pages. They didn't take it seriously. They took it seriously in Londos's day, sometimes with a grain of salt, but he commanded page-width headlines in the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times and so forth. When that kind of disappeared, I think wrestling was treated like, again, a second-class citizen by the sports pages. And as is so often the case with anything, out of sight, out of mind. Kind of like roller derby. That's the comparison I always make to. It was really big in its time, but it kind of fell off the map. And we don't really appreciate how popular it was at the time because there's no way of going back and recapturing what happened in the 30s or 40s today in the 2020s.
Now, obviously, like one of the taglines says Greek immigrant who rescued pro wrestling. Kind of true, right? In a certain aspect. I mean, well, definitely true in a certain aspect.
Oh yeah, I'll give you one of the stories that I end the book with because it's so telling. It's very succinct. But he was inducted in 2014 or 2015, I forget the year, into the Wrestling Hall of Fame in Iowa, Waterloo, Iowa, which is designed for professionals who also have strong amateur records. And he had a very strong amateur record. He was the top light heavyweight amateur on the West Coast for several years. So the induction ceremony is upstairs in the convention center. On the first floor of the convention center, there was a wedding. So you had this incredible mix of people, John, of wrestling fans wearing wrestling attire, and down on the lower floor at a wedding, tuxedos and formal nightgowns and everything. It was kind of cool. As Londos was being inducted, Jim Ross was the MC. And behind Jim, there was a video board that showed the influx of people to the famous 1933 match that Londos had in Greece that drew 60,000 in the stadium, 70,000, probably 90,000 if you count the people on the hillside. And Jim just kind of looked at it, and the only thing Jim said was, he saved the wrestling business. If it wasn't for him, we'd all be downstairs at the wedding. And I thought that was I put that in the book. I thought that was a perfect approximation of what he thought, what JR thought, and the kind of power and credibility that Londos brought to wrestling that I hope I capture some of in this book.
I love that. And I always talk to Dr. Tom Pritchard, and he always mentions, like, why doesn't Londos get mentioned in like the Mount Rushmore, or like more like the Hall of Fame talk, or more of like the greatest of all time talk? He said, if you actually look, historian wise at the drawing power, you can't argue him being probably top one or two.
Yeah, the drawing power is staggering. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we measured it with the help of our friend Matt Farmer out in the Pacific Northwest in crowds of 10,000 or more. And there was a period, I think from 30 to 32, it might have been 29 to 32, when Londos drew crowds, 62 crowds of 10,000 or more, which is amazing because there were only 3 or 4 arenas in the U.S. that seated that many fans. The runner-up had 15, 20, something like that. The disparity in the drawing power was just enormous. But it's not just that. It's the drawing power, it's the gate power, it's the creation of one of the most important holds in wrestling, the sleeper hold. That was his. He called it the anesthetic headlock, which probably would not roll off Gorilla Monsoon's tongue as well as sleeper hold, but still, that's what he came up with. And the other thing that's important, and if you look at it from a long-term perspective, he was the first great immigrant athletic superstar in the U.S. And within wrestling, that kind of paved the way after he retired for the other folks, Argentina Rocca, Edouard Carpentier, the list goes on, for it to be actually safe to be a U.S. citizen and root for somebody from another country. That wasn't done before Londos. The top wrestlers at that time, as you well remember, were Strangler Lewis and Frank Gotch, big old all-American, red-blooded farm boys. He broke that mold, and breaking that mold's proved to be historically really important.
And I know Jim Cornette calls him the Babe Ruth of professional wrestling, which I love that line as well.
It is, and I was delighted that Jim wrote one of the blurbs for the book that you can find, again, shameless plug, on Amazon or something like that, where he describes his feelings about the book. I sent a pre-publication copy to Jim for review and was really happy about that, because Jim has a voice much larger than you or I combined. And if we can get the word out that the wrestling actually did occur before 1984, there was an era before Hulkamania that was important, and it still influences what we do today. That's all for the better. I said a couple of years ago at Cauliflower Alley that wrestling doesn't have a history; it has a past. We have lots of little newspaper clippings and results and so forth, but it doesn't add up to a collective whole on who this guy was, why he was important, and why we should care about him. So this is an attempt to kind of fill that void.
When you look at it, what was the big draw? Was it at Strangler Lewis, or was there another match that was even bigger than that?
In Greece, he was borderline deity. I mean, he was filling out the ancient. He was filling the ancient Athens stadium that you would see in the Olympic Games in the late 19th century and early 20th century. I kind of put that aside because that he was so popular there, it's hard to measure that anywhere else. In the U.S., his feud with Lewis was fantastic, but it was over a period of about 13 or 14 years. They had about a 9-year hiatus where they didn't meet each other in the ring. To say they didn't like each other was an understatement. They were like Ali and Frazier, um, or Conor McGregor and everybody else. Um, so in that stepped Joe Stetcher, um, Renato Gardini, a lot of common Londos opponents. Um, in his best year in 1934, he wrestled 7 current or former world champions, which, just going through results, is something I never saw any champion ever do before. So he took a wide variety of folks into the ring with him, and he almost always came out on top.
When you look at like the overall view of him, why was he such a big draw? Like what made him as the Golden Greek, like what made him so popular that so many people were just dying to see him? Like, was it the it factor, charisma? Because obviously he's not like a gigantic guy. He's not like a Hogan where he's just
No,
like just a big hulking guy.
no, he's Dean Malenko sized, 5'8", maybe 200 pounds if he'd had a lot for dinner. But I think it's a combination of things. Number one, yeah, the Greek factor I think definitely comes in there. He brought in immigrant fans who really had no vested interest in seeing the Midwest farm boys wrestle. That's part of it. He did have it, and wrestling fans can't describe what it is, but they know it when they see it. Okay, it's just the way you carry yourself, your bearing, the way you work in the ring. That was a tremendous source of appeal. During the Depression, though, and I think this is really was key to everything. His big years were during the Depression years, and I don't think a Hulk Hogan or a Terminator, Road Warrior type guy would have been nearly as popular in the Depression. What people wanted to see was somebody who was their size, okay, who could take a thrashing, but through intelligence and resourcefulness and counterholds and maneuvers could somehow wind up on top, even if he was facing a bigger, stronger, more athletic opponent. That's a really important lesson for fans during the Depression. They're sitting there in their seats. Maybe they're having trouble with their job. Maybe they don't have a job. 25% of the U.S. workforce was unemployed. But here's a guy who's saying to them, in effect, I'm using my skills, I'm using my resourcefulness to defeat an enemy. You can do the same thing. That's a great lesson that people took home with them in the Depression. And I quote one of a co-executive from Pennsylvania in the book who went up to Londos after a match like that and said to him in most of these precise words, "Tonight you taught us to be the master of the situation we create." So they went really beyond just the enjoyment of watching a guy trade punches or holds with somebody else to almost an intellectual level discussion, a connection with Londos and the fans during that Depression era. I know that's a little on the academic side for wrestling, but that's also what we're always after at wrestling, isn't it? Just not that connection that I like to watch this guy wrestle, but a real true emotional connection that he's fighting for me. I feel his pain when he's in a hold and he's reaching out his arm. He's actually reaching out toward me. He's making me care. To get back to the word we were talking about before, he's making me care. I care about this. I mean, and let me be clear about that. I don't say that people necessarily even believe this. Londos himself was protective of the business, but he was fairly honest about the showmanship aspects. I don't think believability was the key. I think caring was the key. And he got people to care more than anybody before and precious few after.
True babyface in every sense of the word there.
Yeah, he really was the first traveling babyface too. Frankie Kane, the great Mephisto, worked with him a little bit and knew him pretty well. And Frankie was a small guy like Londos too, and thought it was amazing that a guy 5'8", a Greek immigrant who did not speak particularly good English, could be accepted just about anywhere he went. And that gets back to the ability to connect with an audience and to make them care.
When you look at Londos, like you mentioned, he's not that big. It's a small guy. What's like his background? Is it just amateur wrestling? Did he do other sports? Like what is his background as far as just not pro wrestling, but I mean amateur side and other sports, etc.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And it took me years to find the answer to
Oh
that.
wow.
He really didn't do anything as a youngster in Greece, but he emigrated from Greece. Imagine this in 2024. He emigrated from Greece in steerage class on a ship, steamship, with a cousin as a 15-year-old, not knowing any English, had $20 in his pocket. 3 weeks they crossed the Atlantic to come to the US just to make a new home. I can't imagine letting my 15-year-old go down the street without his cell phone, much less sending him across the Atlantic Ocean in
Yeah.
steerage class.
Oh my God.
That's right. But we picked up the trail of him. It took a while, but we picked up the trail of him, and he ended up in Chicago with a couple of friends, a friend and his brother who he had known in Greece at a resettlement area. And there was a new gymnasium there. And one of the brothers was a runner and would go to this new gymnasium and run around the track all day long. Jim would go and watch the people wrestle. That's where he first really got into this wrestling. He was 16, maybe 17 at the time. And he'd come back from the gym, throw a mattress on the floor, and practice wrestling his friends from Greece, his fellow countrymen, doing the exact same moves that he saw them do at the gym. That's where he first really picked up the passion for wrestling. He eventually ended up in San Francisco with the cousin I referred to coming over on the steamship with. And he made just enough money as a busboy or hauling water for railroads to be able to either go to a gym or to take English lessons. And he decided to go to the gym, that the English could wait. And he just fell into wrestling almost naturally. 5'8", 200 pounds, thick legs, low center of gravity, smart guy, very powerful. You look at pictures of him in that time and you say, boy, he'd be great in the WWE. They'd have him all over the place. And within a couple of years, he became the top light heavyweight amateur on the West Coast, winning AAU championships, winning regional championships, and then proceeding from amateur wrestling into professional wrestling. I know that we still follow that path today. WWE scouts all these college wrestlers. There was really no college wrestling for him to do in San Francisco, but he was a tremendously strong amateur. And that came in handy in his professional career because you always wanted to have the ability to fall back on some real wrestling just in case somebody got a little bit fresh with you in the ring.
That's the thing I think that a lot of people don't realize maybe about that age. You had to be a bit of a shooter, right? Like you had to know catch wrestling back just in case it got a little, a little dangerous. Shooter, hooker. You had to be a tough guy.
Yeah, everybody at that time had to be a shooter, had to be able to defend themselves. And if you look at the great wrestlers of that era, Joe Stetcher, Strangler Lewis, Londos, they were all number one defensive wrestlers. Now wrestling's all about offense and high spots and moves, but they were very careful defensive wrestlers. It was not unusual to see them lock up for a few minutes and not do anything discernible to your eye or to my eye, but struggle within themselves to see who was going to gain the upper hand. You had to be able to protect yourself, especially if you wore the heavyweight championship, because that was worth. And it's not like today where the belt is bestowed on somebody. That was worth a lot of money. And people were always gunning for that. The stories of double crosses and screw job finishes from that era are legendary, and he was not immune to them either. Quick count by a referee looking the other way, an inadvertent disqualification. Those were all problems. So you had to keep up your guard at all times. We don't know exactly how good a shooter Londos was because, like good shooters, he didn't advertise it.
Right.
Didn't tell anybody what a tough guy he was. But in the book, I quote Johnny Heidemann, who wrestled in the Carolinas for a number of years and traveled with him, saying he wouldn't tell you how good he was, but if you wanted to meet him in the gym at 4 o'clock in the morning, he'd be there.
Like that. You got to be a shooter in that era. Speaking of that, though, Lou Thesz, right? Obviously known hooker, also another word for shooter. There, a little bit different, but same
Yeah,
vein,
concept.
same concept. Yep. So Thesz and Londos never wrestled, and were they supposed to wrestle?
No, they never wrestled, and it's a really interesting story. Thesz was a Strangler Lewis protege, and Londos and Thesz never got in the ring. And Thesz's view of Londos, expressed in his own book and comments, so forth, came from Lewis, and they were not favorable because Lewis hated Londos probably until the day he died in 1966. It would have been fascinating to see them get in the ring, but their careers didn't quite overlap. Thesz's first world championship was in 1937. Londos's was in 1938. And within 3 or 4 years, Londos had kind of slowed down, moved to California, wrestled primarily there. World War II interrupted just about everything. And Londos getting in the ring with Thesz in Thesz's prime during his early NWA run would have been, let me do the quick math, 54, 55 years old. So that it probably would not have been a very entertaining match.
Right.
But they were very similar in style. They were not flashy. Okay. There were not a lot of high spots. There was a lot of groundwork, but there was really, in the case of both Thesz and Londos, an exceptional ear for the audience. Not just hearing what the audience wanted, but coming up with the kind of spots that they knew the audience would respond to, staying one step ahead of the audience, in other words. That's the difference between really a good performer and a great performer. The one listens to the audience and tries to get the audience's reaction. The others, Thesz, Londos, a few others, take the audience where they want to take them, and the audience comes along.
So as far as Londos being a former NWA world champion, what lineage is that title? And I know Thesz is a part of that lineage too, but what's that lineage versus the other, the Hack and Schmidt? Like, what's the delineation, I guess, with the two lineages of the NWA world title?
The best way to explain it is to go grab an Etch-a-Sketch, turn it upside down, shake it a few times, maybe pour some Diet Coke on it, step on it, and then you have the lineage of the title.
Oh my God.
It is so confusing. And it's one of the problems I had writing the book for a non-wrestling fan, is trying to keep the National Wrestling Association and the National Wrestling Alliance and the various schemes of the titles in line. I'll give you a short example because it's funny. So Lewis and Londos are engaged in this Cold War, they like Sparta and Athens or Russia and the U.S., and they're not fighting each other. Londos is recognized as world champion by the New York State Athletic Commission. He won't meet Lewis in New York, so the New York State Athletic Commission strips Londos of his title and gives it to Lewis. In California, Lewis is recognized as the world champion. He won't wrestle Londos in California, so the California Athletic Commission withdraws its recognition of Lewis and gives its title to Londos. So when I say you almost have to have a flow chart of all these title changes, that's what I mean. The best way to describe Londos's reign is he beat Bronco Nagurski in 1938 in Philadelphia for a generally accepted title that came from the line you're talking about, the Dean Detton, Dick Shycat, Lewis, Joe Stetcher line. Yeah. Again, not a perfect line, but a good enough. And Londos never lost again and in effect retired the title undefeated. Uh, and then, of course, when you retire the title undefeated, somebody else creates a new title. So Thesz and Londos never met for a title. They both held NWA titles. Thesz's was National Wrestling Alliance. Londos was National Wrestling Association. And you could do yourself in somersaults trying to figure it out. But the bottom line remains they were both awfully good. Thesz and Londos, I talk a little bit about Thesz in the book too. Thesz and Londos were the kind of guys who, when they walked to the ring, and there were no ropes separating the fans from their ring entry, the fans wouldn't reach out and touch them. They just kind of stand there and gaze at them. They had projected this quality, this image that you thought it was proper to kind of stand back just a little bit. They were almost too good to touch. The fans didn't come there to interact with them or slap them on the back like they do today or in past years, but just to watch and be awed by them.
With Londos, right, and all those guys like Ed Lewis and everything else, is there a level of, let's just say, them not where the shooter part comes in, them not kind of adhering to what the finish is? Is that what like the problem with Lewis was? Like, were they doing unplanned finishes? I know obviously Ed Lewis is a part of a screw job before. Was something like that going on of why those two didn't get along?
Yeah, I think that was part of it, is they didn't trust each other in the ring, which was a very dangerous thing. There were two other considerations, one of which is actually new research in the book that hasn't been out before, and it's just a little part of the book, but it's really a big deal. Lewis entered a match. Well, let me go back a step. Fairly early in his career, Londos encountered trachoma, the eye disease that was so prevalent at the time, nearly blinded him. He had to stop wrestling and take these awful copper solutions in his eye, clip the granules off with forceps. It's pretty gross, although it's described in the book. But it came close to ending his career at a very young age. A few years later, Lewis got in the ring with Londos, and Lewis was in advanced stages of trachoma at that time. In fact, Lewis's manager, Billy Sandow, said Lewis couldn't even see the ring. He could just kind of see a shape in front of him. Londos was panic-stricken after that match, that he would catch trachoma again. Raced back into the dressing room, rinsed his eyes out with prophylactic solutions, and I think privately fumed about that for a long time. I think that was a source of the animosity between Lewis and Londos, was that Lewis subjected him to unsanitary conditions. I think that was part of it. On Lewis's end, I think Lewis had a certain amount of jealousy against Londos. Lewis was a big old beefy guy, thinning hairline, didn't always keep himself in shape, drank a little more than he probably should have on a lot of occasions. Londos was a good-looking, always in shape teetotaler who in any match between Londos and Lewis, the fans naturally would gravitate to the small, good-looking Greek immigrant, the underdog. It's pretty simple. He's coming out in a blue robe, and the other guy's named Strangler. That's a pretty easy choice for fans to make. So I think there's a lot of animosity between those two. And as a result, with that, they didn't trust each other in the ring the way wrestlers need to do. There's always the potential for an unforeseen ending. And they didn't wrestle for a period of 8 or 9 years, in large part because they weren't certain of what would actually happen if either of them would follow the script once they got in the ring. Now, if they were shooting at each other, it probably would have been, like most shooting matches, a real boring thing.
Right.
Real wrestling is pretty boring, especially if you have a pair of defensive wrestlers in there. But if they don't trust each other, then that's a good reason to keep ducking and dodging until you can come to some kind of arrangement.
How did Londos kind of just like go through the ranks and get so popular? Was he just always over? Was it just always the it factor? Was there some sort of push that he got or somebody he beat where kind of elevated him? Obviously that always happens in modern day. It's like, wow, he beat this guy, he passes the torch and he goes on. Like, how did Londos get to that level?
Yeah, that's a great question because for a long period of time, the time he started his career until the late 20s, he was the semi-main event guy that the other guy beat on his way to the top. Okay. I'm trying to think of a similar guy without insulting him. A Tito Santana level guy,
Okay.
not the world champion. Very popular, very good, wins most of his matches. But when it comes down to the big one, he's gonna lose to the top heel. Yeah. But by the late 1920s, the wrestling establishment had pretty much gone through everybody available to them as a champion. Londos had, again, I wish I had the notes in front, but Londos had 10 or 11 world championship tries against Joe Stetcher or Ed Lewis, and he'd come up short every time. So he was perceived as the bridesmaid, not the bride. But after a while, when wrestling in the late 20s started to fall on hard times, sending out, tell me if this sounds familiar, sending out recycled wrestlers all the time to do the same stunts and do the same matches again and again and again. You need a fresh face. You need something different. Here's a guy, this guy's a proven draw. Let's take a chance on him. At the same time, he got a manager named Ed White out of Chicago. Not the kind of manager we think of today, but a real manager, controlling his diet, controlling his bookings, advocating for him in meetings. That really helped. You had to have a strong advocate with promoters in those days. And White helped push him over the top. Londos always gave him a lot of credit for that. So it was a combination of things, but it was certainly not an easy path. He started out as the boy wonder at the age of 20, but he wrestled for 16 years before he won the world championship. So he was not exactly a flash in the pan.
Right. So we were saying before, the Babe Ruth of wrestling, right? Jim Londos. He was actually more popular than Babe Ruth, correct? And obviously they're from the same era.
Yeah, and he made more money. He did very well for himself. He commanded large amounts of money. In fact, one sports writer compared the salaries of Ruth on a per game basis and Londos on a per match basis, and Londos was way ahead. But he had certain advantages, John, that if you step back to it, it makes it a lot more understandable. Londos wrestled a huge schedule, 130, 140 matches a year. I know the wrestlers would work more often later on, but in an era where there was virtually no train transportation, there were no interstate highway systems, to go from town to town 130 or 140 times a year is a lot. It also meant, though, that he was in the headlines in the sports pages almost every single day, year round. There was no off season to wrestling. There was to baseball, and there was to golf, and there was to other sports as well. Babe Didrikson was kind of the Londos of track and field and golf. So he was constantly in the headlines. That's important. He was, let me put it this way, Babe Ruth would not go to Scranton, Pennsylvania to play baseball, right? Or Babe Ruth would not go to Richmond, Virginia, where I am, to play baseball. But Jim Londos would go there to wrestle. Okay, he'd go to Scranton and he'd go to Richmond and he'd go to small towns, and that gave the appearance of the big leagues are coming here. The big name is coming here. And when Londos would go to a smaller town or a smaller city, he was a guaranteed feature story, right? Jim Londos is coming to our town. Let's do a little story about him. He was very good with interviews. Not terribly forthcoming, but he was very good with interviews. So he had kind of a level of fame and publicity in the U.S. that rivaled the top U.S. athletes. Now, you add on top of that his popularity in Europe, wrestling in England and France and Greece and Turkey and Egypt and South Africa and the former Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, um, and Australia and New Zealand. He had a worldwide appeal that just kind of a regular old American sports figure wouldn't have. They don't know who Babe Ruth was in Johannesburg, South Africa, but they knew who Londos was when he was selling out the stadiums in 36 and 37 in Johannesburg. So it's amazing that he could do that. And when he was gone in 1936 and 1937 overseas for about 16 months, he came back and he was just as popular in the U.S. as he was when he left.
It's amazing. Like, we shouldn't say the Babe Ruth of wrestling. We should say Babe Ruth was the Jim Londos of baseball, right? I mean, that's what it seems like.
It does. It does. And I forget how long Ruth's career lasted. About 20 years, I'm thinking, maybe. And he was a coach after that. Londos' career lasted 45 years. He wrestled from the time basically he was a teenager until Social Security. I know that Dory Funk just got in the ring in his 80s, and Thesz got in the ring in his 70s, and Londos was 65 when he wrestled his last match. The thing about Londos when he wrestled his last match is he was the main event and he sold out Sydney, Australia.
Wow.
What he could do at that time was probably pretty limited, but the name and the attraction lingered around the world long after you would have considered that he had passed his prime.
Man, what crazy drawing power that is. You know what I mean? Like, just be that much out of your prime, and people are like, oh, I still want to pay to see him. You know what I mean? I'll still sell out a huge venue.
Yeah, John, and that's why it's really tough to compare apples to apples with figures right now. Probably since the mid 80s, even before, people go to see WWE, or they go to see WCW or AEW or whatever it is. In the 30s and 40s, they went to see Londos. There wasn't a wrestling federation. And it's hard to separate his brand from what today is a corporate brand. So it's tough to compare numbers and attitudes, but it's safe to say that nobody drew like him, and there haven't been many who've done that either. I think if I was asked for the book, if he could succeed today at 5'8" and 200 pounds, I think he would have had trouble in the 70s and the 80s with the behemoths, the giant muscle-bound Lugers, Road Warriors, Hogans, and so forth. But you take his size, his technical wrestling ability, and his psychology, and suddenly you're thinking, Bryan Danielson does that.
Oh, yeah.
In the same vein. There's lots of guys in that. Bret Hart was a little bigger, but same kind of thing. As long as you understand the business and can capture the fans' attention and make them care about what you're doing, there's going to be a spot for you. So I don't know if he would have been a world champion, and I'm not sure who the world champion is today either. The lines are just as confusing in 2024 as they were in 1934. But that kind of thing is transferable over the ages. And that's why I say that even though the book is about a guy who wrestled 100 years ago, it still has relevancy today. And can I add one more thing too? That, JBL wrote the foreword to the book.
I was going to mention that. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's true. And I think I'm biased. JBL's foreword is worth the price of the book. John is so good at that, and he does a terrific job of tying what happened back then to today, because in a sense he's followed in Londos's legacy. He was the world champion too, and that's a unique view that very few people have, and certainly is beyond our mere mortal comprehension. But I was really pleased that he did that, and I think that fans would be interested in just reading what he has to say in the first few pages of the book.
He
I
knows
won't
his
spoil. I
history.
won't spoil it because he did such a great job.
He knows his history for sure. He's a historian.
Yeah, he was the first, and he was the first, second, and third person I wanted for the forward because of that, and because I knew of his affection for Londos. We've sat down and talked through some of the Londos matches that are on YouTube. He did a great, JBL did a great job with that. And now he's just going around clotheslining people left and right. Um, More
Yep.
power to him. And I don't know if he got that from the Londos book, but if he did, so much better.
I love that. He's great. Loved JB. I love that he's a real historian. Like he really just studies and loves the business. Like he's old school type of cat. I like that.
There's so much to be learned. There really is. Like I said, we know results from the 30s and 40s and the 50s, and we know what the lineups were because people can go back and digitize newspapers and print out clippings of a match in a card in Charlotte or a card in Richmond or something like that. But to really understand what was going on in terms of the wrestlers, who they were, why we should care about them, what they brought to the business, there's a lot of that still needs to be explored.
I love that some of the matches, like you said, are on YouTube. Like people can actually see Jim Londos, a god 100 years ago, almost. You know what I mean? That's just amazing that people have that footage.
It is, and there's in particular, if anybody out there has an itchy mouse finger right now, there's a match between Londos and Bronco Nagurski from 1938 on YouTube. Not the whole thing is on there, but there's a lot of it on there. This is the match in Philadelphia where Londos won his second world championship, and it's really interesting. It's not something you're going to see this week on SmackDown or Raw or AEW. It's an old style match, but it's really interesting because Londos is in the ring. At that point, he's 44 years old. He's in great shape, but he's 44 years old. He's 5'8" and he's 200 pounds. And he's in against the world champion Bronco Nagurski. Now, Bronco Nagurski was 6'4", 220, a great athlete, tremendous, one of the great football players of all time. In fact, the College Defensive Award for the top defensive college player of the year is named after Bronco Nagurski.
Yeah.
He's younger than Londos, more athletic than Londos, bigger than Londos, stronger than Londos. Now, of course, matches are booked to end a certain way, and Londos was going to get the title there. But the match is really interesting because Londos is thinking the way we might associate with, Ole Anderson 30 or 40 years later. I can't beat this whole guy. He's too big for me. He's too strong for me. But what I can do is pick a body part and work it and work it and work it and work it. And Londos goes after Nagurski's arm in every way, shape he can. Arm bars, stomping on the shoulder. Toward the end of the match, there's some really vicious looking arm breakers, over the shoulder arm breakers. And Londos wins the match that way. And the reason I go into this recitation is because A, it's available on YouTube, but B, it shows you the psychology of the match. He's telling a story. He's telling the kind of story that I referred to earlier. I'm smaller than this guy. I'm not as athletic as this guy. But if I use my intelligence, just like the folks in the Depression, maybe I can overcome the obstacles that face me in my life. That's a terrific lesson, and that's why I think so many folks watched Londos and went home with a smile on their face and maybe a lesson between their ears.
Gotta love that, admire that. It's funny when you think about it with Londos. right, you were saying size-wise, current WWE World Heavyweight Champion Cody Rhodes, I'd say 6 foot 220. So I
Yeah,
mean, he's not that far off, especially nowadays. Like I said, Bryan Danielson is probably 5'8", 205 pounds, or just barely 200 pounds. So like that's perfect. Obviously, Brett probably maybe a little bit over 6 foot, about 230, 235, but still right in that vein. It's like
sure.
he'd fit well. Yeah,
Eddie Guerrero, same thing.
Benoit too. Yeah, yep,
Yeah, Benoit.
yep.
There's room for that, and it kind of cuts both ways, both with Londos and with some of the guys we just talked about. Is they have to overcome that size disadvantage. One of the ways they do it is through really good technical wrestling. Yeah.
Yep.
At the other hand, the size disadvantage becomes an advantage for them because at that size, when you're in against a bigger guy, you are ordinarily the babyface, naturally the guy that the crowds root for. So it kind of cuts both ways. But just because you're small and the babyface doesn't mean anything if you can't actually wrestle. Our friend Ricky Morton has taught us that for the last 30 or 40 years.
Perfect example. Yep. Was he a star at Madison Square Garden as well? Like the original MSG, was he a big star there as well, Londos?
Huge star at Madison Square Garden. In fact, he sort of reopened Madison Square Garden. When he got the world championship, his first world championship in 1930, Madison Square Garden was being run as a wrestling venue very infrequently. Maybe once, maybe twice a year, because the crowds that Jack Curley, the promoter in New York, was getting were in the 6,000 to 8,000 range, maybe 10,000, which doesn't fill half of that building.
Right.
And face it, Madison Square Garden was probably a pretty expensive place to rent. Londos comes along, and all of a sudden, fans start coming in droves, and he's bringing 20,000 people into Madison Square Garden. The first against Ferenc Holoban, Jim McMillan, Gino Garibaldi, 20,000 people filling up the garden. The great story is that at the first match, Londos' first match in the garden, the police were totally unprepared for that number of people that come into Madison Square Garden. And eventually anybody who came through the door got waved into the seating bowl. They didn't even bother to check tickets. So we don't have a precise count on what the attendance was.
Wow, I love that.
He put Madison Square Garden back on the map. And the really interesting thing about Londos is when he's around, business is good. When he goes overseas or he goes out west or goes somewhere else for a little while, business falls off a cliff. That's kind of the ultimate measure. We have to build everything we do around this guy, and believe me, he knew that. He would, you can't get to that point in your wrestling career without having a little bit of ego and knowing what demands to make. But he put the Garden back on the map in the 30s. There's a great line in the New Yorker. The New Yorker wrote a story about Jim Londos, the New Yorker of all things.
Wow, that's weird.
You can imagine that. And the great line about the New Yorker is you could put Strangler Lewis in there with Herbert Hoover wrestling and they wouldn't attract flies, but put Jimmy Londos in there against Poz or myself or anybody else, and all of a sudden they're hanging from the rafters.
Right. Yeah. Crazy. With Londos, did Jess McMahon, did he ever promote Londos?
No, he did not. Jess was around toward the latter part of Jim's career, but he was primarily involved in boxing at that time. In New York, Londos' primary promoter would have been Jack Curley and Toots Mondt. And then after Curley died in 1937, Ray Fabiani from Philadelphia took over New York for a little while. And he was Londos' preferred promoter across the country. And but Londos didn't. After about the Curley's death in 1937, Londos appeared rarely in New York. And to tie back to what I said earlier, Madison Square Garden went blank for wrestling, totally black for about a dozen years, until the reappearance of Gorgeous George. Between Londos and Gorgeous George, there just was not a draw worth having wrestling in the world's most famous arena. That's a
Crazy.
testament to his drawing power.
Yeah, big time, big time. What's the legacy of Londos, and would you put him on the Mount Rushmore?
Yeah, I'd put him on Mount Rushmore for sure. I think he was probably the single most influential wrestler of all time. And I'm a journalist by trade, and I hate to say best or most important, but in this case, you can make a pretty good case that if what Londos did was pretty remarkable, and if you take Londos out of the equation, it's not clear what would have happened. Wrestling very easily could have gone the way of the roller derby, kind of a sideshow attraction that fell apart of its own weight after a period of time. But I think there's really three legacies that he left. Number one was the idea that Americans could root for an immigrant, could root for a foreigner. Today, that's nothing. In the 20s and 30s, the idea that Americans would root for an immigrant or root for a foreigner was not a commonplace idea. There's a lot of racism. The KKK targeted Greeks throughout that period of time. Londos made it safe to root for that guy. Secondly, I think I said before, Londos was a traveling babyface, the first traveling babyface. He showed that you could go as a babyface from town to town and draw money. Prior to that time, and even after to some extent, the babyface was the hometown hero, the local guy, the guy who, in many cases, owned the promotion. Yeah. Londos proved that there was room for somebody above that. And then third, I think I would go back to what I started the conversation with John, which is he showed he really was, if not the first wrestler to do this, the one who popularized it the most, to show that he could draw people in and people could care about the match, could care about him, could care about what they saw on not just an appreciation level as a fan, but something deeper that clicked with their psyche, intellectually and emotionally. And I think that is his ability to do that, his psychology, coming up through the carnivals and through vaudeville and understanding audiences was absolutely essential. And I think it's one of the reasons that he's really worth studying today. You can learn a lot from guys who go before us. WWE does a great job, but a lot of the wrestlers come from the same background and the same performance center, and they don't necessarily get what the Londoses of the world had, which is scratching to fight and eat hand from mouth night after night, sometimes before unreceptive audiences, but along the way, getting an ear for the audience and polishing your craft.
Very, very true, man. Just to me, one of the greatest of all time. Just the drawing power alone is just nuts. But as we head towards the wind down here, head towards the finish, where can everybody get the book? Where can everybody find the book?
I'll give you the easy part. The easy part is to go to londosbook.com, LONDOS book.com, and I have the places you can get it there. If you don't want to go there, you can go to Amazon.com and just type in Jim Londos, barnesandnoble.com. And if you act now before December 31st and go to the publisher's site, which is mcfarlandbooks.com, I think they have a 20% discount through the end of the year. Not just me, it's all their holiday book sale. McFarland's been very good. They did a great job with this, considering they're located in North Carolina, and they were almost washed away in Hurricane Helene.
Oh my God! Oh, brutal.
Yeah, that put a lot of us authors really on edge for a few weeks, but they've recovered nicely and they've done a terrific job.
Got to mention also the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, the storytellers, tag teams, heels, heroes, and icons, and of course Benoit wrestling with the horror that destroyed a family and crippled a sport. Also, where can everybody get all those awesome books that you also wrote?
I think everything is on Amazon. And barnesandnoble.com. I think a couple of them The Heels, I think, needs to be restocked, but we had just talked with ECW Press about restocking that because um, although it came out, as you know, a few years ago, some of the stories in there about the great heels of wrestling are timeless. And then we have a couple more books coming out. Early next year, there will be a book from those of us at Slam Wrestling that features some of the things that we've done in the past at Slam Wrestling, and then some pieces that I've written over the years that just sat unfinished on a flash drive and need to see the light of day. So that should be coming out sometime in February or March. And then I have my next secret project down the road, and I can't tell people what it is, but if it works out, everybody's going to go, ooh, that's pretty cool.
Nice.
It is. It's wrestling. I don't fancy myself a great writer, John. I've got a lot of good material to work with, and Jim Londos. I could have written a book twice as long as this, but maybe that's for another day.
I love that. Where can everybody find you, social media and otherwise?
Twitter, well, X Twitter, whatever we call it, at Steelbelt Steve, Steve Johnson on Facebook, Amazon.com, Steven Johnson UVA, which is where I went. Or you can just email me. I have no trouble telling you it's nwfsteve@gmail.com. I love to hear from people. I love to hear from whether they about this book, whether they like it, or suggestions for improvement. If it does well, who knows what the future holds for it.
I love it. Of course, check out Jim Londos, the Golden Greek of professional wrestling, studies in strength and physical culture. So good stuff there.
Hold it up one more time there. You can. It's a colorized picture. It's actually black and white. But I'm really impressed they were able to colorize it.
Awesome. I love that. Well, everybody, hopefully check out that book. If you're a historian, you gotta be all over that. But Steve, thank you so much for all the time. Really appreciate it.
Well, I'll give you one more thing too. And I just hope the book, the belt he's wearing, still exists, but not in a place that's accessible to me or you. It was given to him by a group of millionaires, and it has 12 panels on it that depict in graphic relief the history of wrestling from Greco-Roman times to the present.
Nice.
I know about the spinner belt. I know about the WWE belt. I know about the AEW belt. Boy, this is the one I wish I could see.
Yeah, big time. That's awesome. And obviously, it's on that cover. It's good stuff there. But Steve, thank you so much for all the time.
Oh, it's always good to talk to you guys. I appreciate it, and thanks for having me on.